So in Ireland there are generally three key harvests. There are the two that come early in the year. There's the turf harvest, which is important for fuel and for warming your home over the winter, but it's also a really important source of income for a family, so they could sell turf to buy whatever it was that they needed. Then a little bit later on than that, already brought in around this time of year, is also the potato harvest. So that would have been brought in and buried in drills to keep the potatoes over the winter, protect them from frost and stuff like that. But as you get into mid-August and into early September, this is the key time of year for the drawing in of the grain harvest. Now in the west of Ireland in particular, there wasn't a huge tradition of grain going. We do have some oats growing in this part of the world, because oats is a very tough type of grain and survives very well in even acidic soils and with bad damp weather. But in the north and east of the country, you get into the lighter grains like your barley and your wheat. So there's a great tradition of growing wheat and barley and rye in Ireland, but barley and wheat mainly, and wheat particularly as you go further east and south in the country. So that would all be brought in at this time of the year. Even nowadays, but the system of bringing it in has become much more advanced. We've got combine harvesters and they can do in an hour what it'd take in a community to do in a couple of days. So traditionally, there are a number of steps involved in drawing in the harvest. The first thing that had to be done was the thistles had to be pulled from the field. Because you're doing everything by hand, you can't have people walking through grabbing handfuls of thistles. So you have the thistle tongs, and what would happen is young lads were sent through the harvest with the tongs, and what they'd do is they'd actually use this large wooden tongs to pull the thistles up out of the crop, and they'd clear the fields of as many thistles as they could find. So when the people came behind them doing the actual cutting and gathering, there was as little as possible to damage the hands. The main tool of the harvest was the scythe. Scythes were used generally by men. Women would use, and girls would use the billhook, which is a much smaller implement and a much more ancient of the two. The scythe is a much more modern introduction, particularly to Ireland. It came into England in the early to mid 19th century. Up until that point, we were using the billhook or the sickle. The sickle is much more difficult. It's back-breaking work because you're constantly stooped and grabbing what you're cutting before you cut it. The scythe sped up the work because it is a much, much larger blade. It can be 2 to 3 foot in length. And you're standing upright and swinging it through the crop. A good scythesman could cut an acre a day. And that was the sign of a quality scythesman, as if he could cut his way through an acre a day. So once the crop had actually been cut, it was left over to lie on its side as gently as possible, because every grain counted. So this was all very gentle work. It had to be done at a pace, but it was also done very gently because every grain counted. And the people then coming behind, sometimes kids or women coming behind the scytheman, it'd stook the grain. So they'd get it up into bunches or stooks and they'd be put together. Eventually then they bring in the cart, the donkeying cart, or a horse if they were lucky enough to have one, and that was then put onto that and drawn in. And it would be stored in the byre, which is at the sheds next to the house, until the time came for threshing. Now the threshing was only done once all of the grain had been brought in. Threshing generally in Ireland was done in the household, so it was actually brought into the kitchen, so into the main room of the house. We're talking for the most part single room cottages here. So it was brought into that single room. A large sheet would be spread out across the floor, and the wheat or oats or whatever it was thrown down on that. And using a flail, which is it's got 2 sticks on it, so you'll see it in the gallery. Using a flail, they would then beat the heads of the whatever crop it was. This released the grain, but it also released the fine chaff that surrounds the seed itself. So the next step then was, on the first windy day after all the threshing had been done, was to actually winnow. And this is where an instrument I'm sure you've heard of, the bodhrán, comes from. So the bodhrán is actually a wood frame with a goat skin over it, and we use it as a musical instrument, but it was also used as a farming implement. What they do is they take handfuls of the wheat and chaff, they put it into the bodhrán. They'd have a large sheet spread out in front of them in the middle of a green patch, and they'd stand with their back to the wind, and they'd gently throw the grain up in the air. And as the wind passed through the grain, the chaff being lighter was dragged away and the grain would fall at their feet. So that was the winnowing process. Once all the grain had been winnowed, it was then taken and put in a silo. Now these were generally handmade affairs because they couldn't afford to have big stone grains or stone-built silos. And they wanted to limit the amount of time the grain was sitting before it went to the mill for grinding. Now, some people would have ground their own grain at home using quernstones, but by the middle of the 19th century, it was much more common to bring it to a mill, to a local mill, where it was then ground into flour. And part of the payment for the grinding of the grain into flour was to leave some of the flour with the miller. If you couldn't afford to pay him in cash, you'd leave it with the miller. And so that was the way it was done. So they'd always have their own supply of flour then for the home. Oats was used. It was used for things like porridge and oat cakes. It was a food supply. Nowadays it's more commonly used as a food for fodder for animals. But it was a really important extra source of carbohydrates to people on the west coast if they could afford to grow it at all.